In 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton set out to do something no human being had ever done: cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. It was an era before GPS or modern satellite tech, meaning they were walking into the most hostile environment on Earth completely blind. This map outlines the sheer scale of the expedition. The plan was to land at the Weddell Sea, trek 2,900 kilometers straight through the South Pole, and come out the other side. If everything went perfectly, the journey would take 120 days. But everything did not go perfectly. Long before reaching their starting line, their ship, the Endurance, hit sea ice far denser than expected. Miles from their drop-off point, the ship froze completely solid. They were stuck. Then the Antarctic winter arrived. This meant 24 hours of continuous freezing darkness. Worse, the sea ice wasn't static. It was shifting, piling up, and driving massive blocks of ice with thousands of tons of pressure directly into the ship's wooden hull. At that exact moment, the mission to cross Antarctica died. With zero radios and no way to contact the outside world, the 28 men aboard faced a totally different reality. They were no longer explorers. They were castaways trying to survive an impossible nightmare. As the ice finally shattered the ship's timbers, Shackleton ordered the crew to evacuate. They salvaged what they could and set up a makeshift camp directly on top of the frozen ocean, a floating, drifting slab of ice. Moving across the ice required dragging everything by hand, so Shackleton enforced a ruthless 2-pound weight limit per man. Personal value meant nothing. To set the standard, Shackleton threw his own gold coins and personal Bible directly into the snow. He made exactly one exception. Shackleton allowed the expedition's photographer, Frank Hurley, to keep 150 photographic negatives. He knew that if they somehow survived, these images would be the only proof that this ordeal actually happened. For months, the crew lived on that shrinking sheet of ice. They survived on meager rations of biscuits and hunted seals, watching helplessly as the ocean currents drifted them further and further away from any known land. Surviving freezing temperatures is a physical challenge, but surviving endless isolation is a psychological one. Shackleton strictly controlled the daily routines and actively lied to his men about their food reserves. He knew that keeping their minds occupied was the only way to stave off total despair. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The frozen surface beneath their camp suddenly cracked wide open, threatening to drop the men straight into the freezing ocean below. They had no choice but to launch the 3 one-ton lifeboats dragged from the wreck. For days, they navigated through a deadly, shifting maze of icebergs and open water, rowing until their hands bled. Finally, 497 days after they last set foot on solid ground, the boats dragged onto the shores of Elephant Island. The relief of hitting land was incredibly short-lived. Elephant Island featured hostile, rocky cliffs and freezing temperatures. It was completely cut off from global shipping routes. No humans had ever inhabited these shores. Escaping the drifting ice had effectively locked them inside a frozen prison. To actually get rescued, Shackleton would have to launch a suicide mission back into the open ocean. He selected 5 of his strongest men, modified one of the tiny 22-foot lifeboats, and prepared to sail toward the only inhabited place he knew of, the whaling stations on South Georgia Island. This animated map shows the sheer absurdity of their plan. To reach South Georgia, they had to cross 1,300 kilometers of open ocean, navigating directly through a stretch of water known as the Drake Passage.
This visualization illustrates the extreme lethality of that sea. The Drake Passage is a graveyard holding the wreckage of over 800 large ships, torn apart by 12-meter rogue waves that easily dwarf a 22-foot wooden boat. For 3 straight weeks, the men took turns rowing and bailing freezing salt water out of the hull. They laid down in the dark to eat, vomited constantly, and somehow survived a massive hurricane just as land finally came into view. Against all odds, they reached South Georgia, but the hurricane had forced them to land on the entirely wrong side of the island. The whaling station and their salvation was on the opposite coast. Standing directly between their landing point and the whaling station was a completely uncharted 10,000-foot glaciated mountain range. No human being in history had ever crossed the interior of South Georgia Island on foot. Doing it required specialized climbing gear, well-fed expert mountaineers, and clear maps.
Shackleton had starving men, shredded clothes, and zero equipment. Shackleton and 2 of his men tied themselves together with a makeshift rope and began to climb. For 36 hours straight, they marched without sleep, cutting footholds straight into vertical ice walls with an axe and descending blindly into freezing valleys. Finally, as they dragged themselves over the last ridge, they heard a sound they hadn't heard in nearly 2 years, the blast of an industrial steam whistle echoing up from the Stromness whaling station below. The physical nightmare for Shackleton was over, but his responsibility as a leader wasn't. There were still 22 men waiting back on the desolate rocks of Elephant Island, completely unaware if their captain was dead or alive. When Shackleton and his 2 companions stumbled into the station, the manager didn't even recognize them. Their faces were blackened with soot and frostbite, their clothes were rags, and the entire world had presumed them dead for years. Meanwhile, the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island were hanging on by a thread. They huddled under 2 overturned lifeboats to block the wind, enduring severe starvation and gangrene infections that led to a gruesome amputation. Mutiny and despair were constantly at the door. To keep the crew from giving up, the second in command, Frank Wild, instituted a strict routine. Every single morning, he forced the men to pack their bags, insisting the boss was coming that day. Wild's faith was justified. Shackleton immediately started chartering rescue ships, failing 3 separate times due to heavy sea ice. Finally, on August 30, 1916, piloting a borrowed Chilean vessel, he broke through the thick ice and spotted the camp. As the boat approached, Shackleton counted the figures on the shoreline. Every single man was there. Against all mathematical odds, the ice, the isolation, the ocean, and the mountains, all 28 members of the Endurance crew survived. Fast forward 106 years to 2022. Deep-sea investigators plunging 10,000 feet into the freezing Weddell Sea discovered the wreckage of the Endurance. Because of the extreme cold, the ship sits on the ocean floor in perfectly preserved condition. As an exploration mission, the expedition was an absolute failure. Shackleton never crossed Antarctica. He barely even touched the land. But the Endurance is not studied today for its geographic achievements. It stands as ultimate proof that when the original plan completely shatters, staying alive depends on sheer mental adaptability and the quiet, unbreakable willpower of a unified team.